In this lecture, we're going to learn how to use CSS and JavaScript transitions together. We're not forced to use one or the other. You do have the option of using both CSS classes and JavaScript hooks to perform different jobs. For example, you may use them for performing background tasks while the animation is handled with CSS. That's definitely a good way to use both CSS and JavaScript together. In the app component file, we disabled CSS by setting the CSS property to false. By setting it to false, Vue will not add the CSS classes to the elements entering or leaving the document. Vue will ultimately rely on JavaScript hooks to handle the transition. The default value for this property is true. This value allows for both CSS classes and JavaScript hooks to be used. Let's change this to true. Currently, we're not using CSS to transition the elements. On the other hand, we're using JavaScript to create a growing effect. As I mentioned earlier, it's much more efficient to use CSS to handle animations. When you're using both CSS and JavaScript, Vue will use the CSS duration times to set the length of the transition. The done function provided by the hooks is optional. If you don't call the done function, that's perfectly fine. Vue will still know when the transition is complete. Since we're going to allow CSS to handle the animation, we'll clean up the hook functions we created in the previous lecture. In both the enter and leave functions, we're going to comment out the code that creates the JavaScript transition. It doesn't make sense to have two different animations that could potentially cancel each other out. We're going to remove the done parameter from the enter and leave functions. We must remove it. Otherwise, Vue will assume you want to use JavaScript to determine when the transitions are complete. By omitting this parameter, Vue will use the duration in the CSS to know how long the transition lasts. We're leaving behind the log statements. One last thing, we'll add the name property to the transition component. We'll reuse the fade animation we created in CSS. Set this to fade. After making those changes, switch back to the browser with the console opened. Trigger the animations by pressing the button. The elements will transition with the CSS classes. In the console, the hook functions are still logging the same messages. Despite not calling the done function, Vue will know when to call the next hook and when to start the next animation. This is because we're not accepting the done argument. If it's not present in the functions we defined, Vue will use the CSS durations to determine when the animations are complete. This is great because it gives us a whole lot more flexibility. If you want to send a request, update the state, or perform some other asynchronous task, you can do so without worrying about if the transition ends. This approach is how I recommend you use JavaScript hooks. Leave the animation to CSS.